A lot of you want the Jets to trade for Aaron Rodgers. I don't think it's that good of an idea at his current price. We're going to go toe-to-toe on Aaron Rodgers on today's mailbag edition of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, February 8th, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GangrenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, a big thumbs up for this episode. These things help the channel out and help other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Nissan. The only thing more exciting than the big game is the all-new, all-electric 2023 Nissan Ariya. There's only 4 days left until the Super Bowl. Are you ready? The Nissan Ariya, the EV for people who love to drive. Learn more at nissanusa.com. Well, today we have our weekly mailbag show. Thanks so much to all of the listeners who sent in questions. Unsurprisingly, lots of questions about the quarterback position, in particular Aaron Rodgers. Let's begin. Our first question, John, you and many others have expressed concern about Rodgers' cap hits in years 3 and 4 of his contract if he's traded. He could be retired at that point. This is a fair concern, as is the concern around the trade compensation, especially if we're talking 2 first-round picks. But if the trade compensation is more along the lines of a 2023 second and a 2024 conditional second-round pick that could become a first if the Jets make the playoffs or go to the AFC Championship game, then are the Jets not still set up to take the long-term approach at the quarterback position, similar to the pre-Mahomes Chiefs that you have described in the past? They would have at least 2 drafts, and just as likely 3 drafts if Rodgers retires after 2 years, to wait for a guy they love. Not only do you avoid needing to draft someone, but if the drafted quarterback then hits his rookie contract offsets, a lot of the pain from Rodgers' dead money is gone. The risks are meaningful, but it does not seem like most people who are against acquiring Rodgers are just doesn't just seem like most people who are against acquiring Rodgers are assuming the worst case scenario in terms of trade compensation and length of stay in New York. So, big question there. The question is, would it make sense if the Jets were able to get Rodgers for a couple day 2 picks, and doesn't Rodgers buy you some time? I think that's essentially what it boils down to. Because something I've said on this show frequently, and the analogy I've always used is Alex Smith. When the Chiefs got Alex Smith in 2013, he was their quarterback for 5 years. And in those 5 years, Kansas City was never desperate to draft a quarterback. They could essentially, unlike the Jets in 2009 when they drafted Mark Sanchez, in 2018 when they drafted Sam Darnold, and in 2021 when they drafted Zach Wilson, the Jets in all 3 of those situations were desperate for a quarterback, so they had to take somebody. They had to take the guy that was there. Kansas City was never desperate for a quarterback, so they could wait for the perfect guy and make their move for Patrick Mahomes. And not only that, after they got Mahomes, he was not rushed into the lineup. So would Aaron Rodgers be like that? And I think the answer to that is probably not. And the reason that I say that is, if you look at the way Rodgers' contract is set up, it's essentially a 2-year contract. There's 2 years left on the contract. The way it was drawn up, technically there are 4 years left on the contract, but the last 2 years really are at a very low salary, and it's like those years just exist so that you can push the cap hit further into the future. Because if you have a 4-year contract, you can stretch cap hits out over 4 years. It gives you more financial flexibility in the short run. The problem is if Rodgers retires, the Jets are, and it's true no matter what, but essentially if Rodgers retires, the Jets would be due either a $60 million bill, and this is if Rodgers retires after 2 years. Assuming he retires after 2 years, the way his contract's currly written, the Jets would either get a $60 million cap bill in 2025 or $30 million in 25, $30 million in 2026. And that's what makes this tough. I think that's the big reason that this is kind of a non-starter for me, at least unless Rodgers was willing to take a pay cut. And I hesitate to say that because why would Rodgers take a pay cut to come to the Jets? There's got to be some team that's out there willing to pay him a salary. And I think the fundamental difference between Alex Smith and Aaron Rodgers is that Smith gave the Chiefs 5 years. With Rodgers, I think you can assume that there's kind of a fixed limit. You've got 2 to 3 years. So you're going to have to, at some point in the next 3 years, draft a new quarterback, and you're going to be down draft picks, because even if you're giving up a couple day 2 picks, well, that means you have less resources to fill out the rest of your team. So now we're talking about drafting somebody who's not really going to play for the next 2 years or so, and you're not filling another void on your team, and you're going to need that because you need if you're going to deal with these cap hits that Rodgers will have after he retires. If you're going to be $30 million down in the cap in 25 and 26, then you really, really need young talent to be able to step in, and you're going to be down draft picks, because you're not only going to be down the pick you use on a quarterback, you're going to be down the 2 picks you give up for Rodgers. And day 2 picks are still valuable, so I still think you're giving up an awful lot. And I think my calculus on this would be very different if you were getting Aaron Rodgers for 5 years. And I'm talking about like if you got Aaron Rodgers at 35 for 5 years. If you got Aaron Rodgers from like year 35 to year 40, I think it would be worth giving up a lot for him. And I guess fundamentally, my issue with this is I have a number of issues, but essentially the Jets are going to be required to pay a king's ransom for a short Rodgers tenure with them if they make a trade. If I was to get 5 years of Rodgers in his prime or close to his prime, I'd be willing to give up king's ransom for that. If Rodgers cost about half as much as we're expecting him to, and he was only giving you 2 years, I'd be fine with that. But you're giving up so much for such a short run, presumably. And you could say, well, what if he wants to play beyond 2 years? I don't know that we can assume that. And I think that maybe Tom Brady has kind of distorted our perceptions of how we can reasonably expect a quarterback to age. Because what Brady's done playing at a top level into his mid-40s, it's just not that common. It's not only is it not common, there's really no comparison in modern NFL history. Now you could say the game has changed. They don't allow guys to be hit at the quarterback position as much anymore. The roughing the passer penalties have gone up in even in the last 8 to 10 years. It's much easier to last as a quarterback. Well, Drew Brees really declined near the end. Phillip Rivers was not the same quarterback he was. Matt Ryan is kind of, finished. So, and I know Rodgers is better than those guys, but if you're talking about giving up premium resources for Aaron Rodgers, he needs to be Aaron Rodgers. He can't be 80% of what Aaron Rodgers used to be. So, it's not that, again, I'm not against the principle of trading for Aaron Rodgers at the right price. It's just, I don't see how the Jets get to that right price. And I don't think that I don't think he's a guy who really helps you in the long term. I don't think he's a guy you view as somebody who buys you time to find your next quarterback. If you're giving up this king's ransom for Rodgers, he's got to win the Super Bowl in the next 2 years. And I don't think the Jets are a Super Bowl team. I think what they are is they're a team that probably makes the playoffs, and then you say, well, maybe they get hot at the right time and go on a run. And I just don't think, even if we're talking a couple day 2 picks, for the price tag he's got, it's an awful lot to ask. So, I think I'd be looking in another direction. Quite frankly, I would. Our next question, John, you've said it many times over through the years. Teams, when they get rid of a coach, they get the polar opposite as a replacement, and that's what the Jets did to the offensive coordinator. LaFleur was LaFleur was pass first in philosophy, and seems to have been brash, stubborn, and rubbed many people the wrong way. Whereas Hackett is more of a run-first coach and known to be very player-friendly. Yeah, isn't that always how it works? It's kind of like Costanza. If what I was doing is wrong, then the opposite must be right. And I think it goes beyond that. In the NFL, and this is especially true when a head coach feels like his job is in jeopardy, you circle the wagons. And you go with guys you trust. And we know Robert Saleh really trusts Nathaniel Hackett. We know they have a relationship that goes back a very long time. It goes back to days when they coached together in Jacksonville. So I think as much as anything, Saleh was looking for a guy he knows he can trust, because it kind of sounds like ownership may have gotten involved here. It sounds like the owner may have kind of forced Saleh's hand a little bit in making a coordinator change. Saleh has to know that his job is probably on the line in 2023. So in situations like this, it's very easy to look inward and just find somebody who your guy, somebody you go with. So I think on top of what you mentioned, on top of some of the areas where maybe Hackett's a little bit, maybe Hackett's the opposite of LaFleur. Hackett's a guy who has Saleh's trust, and I think that this is just my guess, but I would have to say it seems to me like that's something that Saleh really values right now, knowing his job's on the line. Now, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we will continue our weekly mailbag show. We'll talk more Aaron Rodgers. It's the topic every Jets fan wants to talk about, so we'll discuss it a little bit more as we continue this Wednesday mailbag edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. You've heard me talk about this mobile game. It's a lot of fun to play, and now it's your turn to compete. But more on that later. Have you ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM and managing a football franchise? Well, your dream can come true, and if that's the case, this game's definitely for you. You'll manage every strategic aspect of your team, play through seasons, and lead your team to glory trying to build a dynasty. With Ultimate Football GM, you are responsible for controlling the destiny of your franchise by hiring the right players and by hiring the right coaches and coordinators, trading players, and navigating your franchise through free agency and the draft and all the ups and downs of the season. And all this is in a challenging and realistic game world. Ultimate Football GM is completely free and playable offline. You can play on the go as you want and when you want to. And we've created a Locked On League for you to compete against other Locked On fans all over the world. Can you be the ultimate Locked On Football GM? Choose the Locked On League in the app to join. Can you create a football dynasty? And by the way, Locked On Jets listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using promo code Locked On, all caps, in the game store. That's Locked On in all caps, so make sure to check it out today. And to download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up on the app stores. Again, that's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM, start your dynasty today. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listen every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms. Let's continue our weekly mailbag. Our next question: most fans seem happy to give up 2 firsts for Aaron Rodgers. In this scenario, he would cost the team both money and picks. Rather than using those resources on Rodgers, would it make more sense to sign a veteran like Jimmy Garoppolo to a 2 to 3 year deal and use those picks to trade up for a rookie quarterback to sit behind him, something the Jets have not had the luxury of doing, and ultimately have a veteran for this current team's window, and additionally have a quarterback on a rookie deal to maintain the roster once the veterans deal is up? I think that the Jets, if for whatever reason people don't think the Jets are going to be in on a quarterback in the draft, and I guess it makes sense from the standpoint that Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh's job is on the line, so they're going to want to go with the proven option at quarterback. In fact, they've told us they're going to go with the proven option at quarterback, and when your job's on the line, you don't necessarily want to entrust that to a rookie. But if we're talking long-term, the Jets should absolutely be looking to draft a quarterback, this year. And I'm not saying you draft a quarterback no matter what, because as we've discussed, that gets you into trouble. When you enter the draft saying, I need to draft a quarterback, you're going to make a mistake. But if you're on the clock and there's a prospect there who just so happens to line up with the value and you think he's got the tools to succeed, the Jets should make the pick. I don't know if they're going to, again, because you have a lot of people whose incentives are very short term in Robert Saleh and Joe Douglas. But I think that's a logical approach. And listen, I've said it. I think Rodgers at the current price just costs too much. And the other problem with Rodgers is I don't see how the price goes down. Again, is he going to take a huge pay cut to come to the Jets? Is Green Bay going to just give him away? Because again, even if it's not 2 first-round picks, if it's 2 day 2 picks, that's a lot to give up, considering the fact that Rodgers is going to eat up a lot of cap space after we presume he retires. And after he retires, if he's eating up all the cap space, you really, really, really need young, cheap talent that you've drafted, and you've given away some picks then. So, I don't love the idea of Rodgers. I don't love the idea of Garoppolo either. You keep talking into Garoppolo at a certain price, but I think he's shown a real inability to stay healthy. And while I'm not a doctor, at some point you have to say, the best ability is availability. And Garoppolo has really not shown an ability to stay on the field. But if you're not going to I feel like that's probably the approach. I think you want to find somebody who can provide you some stability at the quarterback position. And then after you've got that stability, draft somebody. And, if the rookie steps in and shows he's ready to play, that's great. You go back to 2012, the Seattle Seahawks, and Robert Saleh was part of this coaching staff. The Seattle Seahawks signed a veteran quarterback, Matt Flynn, in free agency. He was actually Aaron Rodgers' backup in Green Bay. At that point, he had started 2 games in the NFL and played really well in both of them. So Seattle thought maybe we found a hidden gem. They got him in free agency, and they drafted Russell Wilson. And they thought Matt Flynn was going to start. They did not think Russell Wilson was going to be that great. Russell Wilson was a 3rd-round pick. And Russell Wilson surprised them. He earned the starting job, and they decided to play him. It ended up working out for them. So I think you give yourself as many shots at the quarterback position as possible. I think you always should be looking to add a young, talented quarterback. And I think that you don't want to put yourself in a position where he has to play, but you put yourself in a position where if he's ready to step in, you put him in. Our next question. Giving up draft pick compensation or overpaying for a quarterback does not make any sense. Why not strengthen the other areas of the team, draft a developmental quarterback on day 3, and go with Mike White, Sam Darnold, or another cheap quarterback who provides good value from a contract perspective? I don't know that those guys give you good value from a contract perspective, though. I think it's easy to overstate the expectation, overstate how much a quarterback can give you, because it is a team game. And I think sometimes we go a little bit overboard, giving the quarterback a little bit too much credit when the team wins, a little bit too much blame when the team loses. But I think the quarterback's important enough that you're not going to win with a Sam Darnold. Listen, I was Sam Darnold's #1 cheerleader when he was with the Jets, but I've come to realize he's not really a good NFL quarterback. Mike White, listen, I don't want to say anything bad about Mike White, because he proved me wrong. He showed that he belongs in the league in some capacity. I think that capacity, though, is more of a backup quarterback. I don't think he's got enough. I don't think he's accurate enough. I don't think he makes good enough decisions. I don't think he's aggressive enough. You know what the thing about Mike White this year is? He was at his best in situations where the Jets were behind and he kind of had to push the ball down the field. I think early in some of those games he started, he was a little too conservative. Then the Jets fell behind and he kind of had to push it down the field, and that's where he played some of his best football. But I don't know that Mike White's going to win you games over the long haul. So, I mean, look, I think there's more to it than the quarterback, but the quarterback's a really important component. And I don't know that you're winning games with Mike White or Sam Darnold. Listen, you can put all the pieces around those guys you want. On some level, there has to be a baseline of play. Now, if you go out and get, I don't know, a Jacoby Brissett or a Ryan Tannehill, you're going to have a tough time. But those guys give you enough that if you put the right pieces around them, I think you can have some success. I think you're kind of threading the needle with those guys because they're not really that great. I think I'd even throw Garoppolo in that mix. I don't think Garoppolo is as good as his numbers would suggest. I don't think he's as good. He's certainly not as good as his 1-loss record would suggest. By the way, quarterback wins, not a stat. Quarterback record, not a stat. Not an individual stat, at least. Maybe a team stat. Those are guys, if you put them in the right situation and you build up the rest of the team around them, they could win games. So I think if you're going with that approach, you have to aim a little bit higher. I don't think you can do it with White or Darnold. I think you can do it maybe with Garoppolo, with Tannehill, with Brissett, but it's really tough to do. You kind of have to thread the needle. It's a very low margin for error when you have that type of quarterback play where you're just getting kind of competent average play where your quarterback's not making a difference. Easier said than done. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're actually going to turn our attention away from the quarterback position. We're going to talk offensive line. It's another critical spot. It's another critical spot the Jets have to upgrade, and we'll discuss it in more detail as we continue this Wednesday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by PrizePicks. Do you love playing daily fantasy? Are you focused on the Super Bowl? Do you think Patrick Mahomes is going to throw for more than 320 passing yards? Well, then let me tell you about PrizePicks. Here's how it works. You pick 2 to 6 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 25 times your money on any entry. There's no competing against other people. It's just you against the projections available. And PrizePicks offers projections on any sport you watch. So the NFL season's ending on Sunday, but don't worry. You can play with the NBA, the NHL, PGA, men's and women's college basketball, esports, NASCAR, tennis, MMA, boxing, Euro basketball, cricket, and my personal favorite, disc golf. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. It's just that easy. They have safe and fast withdrawals, and they're currently operational in over 30 states and Canada. So download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100. You with promo code LOCKEDON. So if you deposit $50, PrizePicks gives you $50. If you deposit $100, PrizePicks gives you $100. And don't forget to enter promo code LOCKEDON at sign up for an instant deposit match of up to $100 using PrizePicks. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Built Bar. Are you looking for a delicious treat but you don't want all the fat and calories? Then you've got to try a Built Bar. The holiday season is now in our rear-view mirror. I hope you're keeping your New Year's resolution. If yours was to eat a little bit healthier this year, you got to try Built. With Built, healthy is actually tasty. They're so delicious that you'll think they're good for you. And what makes these bars so good? Well, for starters, they're covered in 100% real chocolate. That's right, delicious real chocolate. And they come in unbelievable flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, and coconut almond. And the bars, most of them only have 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, and 17 grams of protein. And now you don't need to wait around to get a box. For years, I've been telling you about ordering your Built bars at Built.com. You can still do that, but you can also get them at your local Walmart or Sam's Club. So head to your nearest Walmart today, walk into the pharmacy section, and grab yourself a box of Built bars. You can pick up a 4-bar box of cookies and cream, double chocolate, or coconut puffs. Or if you're close to Sam's Club, run in and grab a 13-bar box with hit flavors like brownie batter and churro. You can thank me later. And of course, you can still go to Built.com. Built bars. Absolutely delicious protein bars. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Wednesday. We're doing our weekly mailbag show. Our next question: if the Saints get Derek Carr, is that proof the salary cap is fake? Yeah, I keep hearing this, that the cap is fake because teams maneuver around it to create cap space. You see teams that are always tied up against the cap who figure out ways to create cap space. The cap is not fake. The cap is real. Now, what's happened is the cap's been around for 30 years now. So teams have figured out how to work. They figured out how to find the loopholes in the system. They figured out how to maneuver. You're not going to see, when the first cap first came out, there were teams that had no idea what they were doing. They really did not understand the rules. They made a lot of very foolish decisions that ended up really hurting their franchise for years and years and years. You're never going to see that again because teams now understand how to utilize the cap. But I think sometimes we view these things too much in cataclysmic terms. Because I think we view, like, if somebody says there's bad cap management, it means it's going to bring the franchise to its knees. It's going to completely destroy everything. That's not what bad cap management does. It impacts you more on the margin. So, like, the Saints are a good example. The Saints are always trying to... Saints are essentially, what they do is, more or less, they take cap hits and they put them on the credit card. They just kick them to the future. And eventually it comes back to hurt you. Because, did the Saints lose key players the last couple of off seasons? Well, they lost Trey Hendrickson a couple of years ago. They lost Marcus Williams last year. So clearly it impacts you. And that's, I guess, we go back to this Rodgers thing. I'm not going to say, I think sometimes, again, we view these things we just go overboard with our descriptions of these things. I don't think Aaron Rodgers makes the Jets a contender. I also don't think it would, quote unquote, mortgage the future. But I think it would do appreciable harm to the Jets in the future. I think it would be it would create some those dead money hits would create pretty big obstacles to the team going forward. They're not going to lose Sauce Gardner over Aaron Rodgers. They're not going to lose Quinnen Williams because Aaron Rodgers has a big dead money hit. But you could lose a guy like a DJ Reed, somebody who's really valuable to your team, or you might not be able to sign a key player who could move your team forward in the first place. So it's never really a case where you're going to completely destroy your franchise. So in that sense, I think sometimes the discussion about the cap is kind of misunderstood. It's not something that really, unless you're just totally reckless, you're not going to completely destroy your team, but you're going to leave yourself at a big disadvantage. And the teams you're competing against are some of the best teams in the NFL. And if you leave yourself at a 10% disadvantage on the cap, it's going to materially impact your chances to compete for a championship. So that's really where the cap issues come in. It's not so much that you're going to end up, struggling to field a roster. And our last question, John, I think it's fair to say that the best Jets teams since Parcells arrived to the present have coincided with a good to elite offensive line. If you look at the final 4 teams this year, they are all dedicated to forming an excellent line. Philly and San Francisco are talked about. Kansas City added Orlando Brown and Joe Thuney to draft picks. And even Cincinnati added 3 starters to a line that got them to the Super Bowl last year. Joe Douglas has to a certain extent failed at this aspect, but not for a lack of trying. With only one true building block in Elijah Vera Tucker, how high of a priority should fixing this line be? Well, I think it should be pretty high. I think the Jets need to fix their offensive line. And as you said, the only real success story right now is Elijah Vera Tucker. The other success story is Connor McGovern, who, for whatever reason, I can't figure out why the Jets are so willing to let this guy go, but apparently there have been 0 contract negotiations about an extension for McGovern. After the year you just had, you got this center who's been really durable for you, who's barely missed a snap over the last 3 years. I think he's missed 2 games in the last 3 years. And you're just going to let him go after you've had like a million injuries on the offensive line and you've had really shaky play? You're just going to let this guy go who's a good center, a borderline top 10 center? I don't understand it. But, I always like to have a balanced team. You can build a winning team any number of ways. You can be weak at certain positions and still work around it. I think you can work around a weak offensive line and still win games. But, this is an area where I'm old school. I think there are a lot of areas where I'm new school. I really think an offensive line should be a focus. I think that's after quarterback, that's the first spot you should look to build on the offensive line, because football ultimately is a game of aggression. And when you control the trenches, it's a huge example. And I think the best description I ever heard about the offensive line is an elite offensive line does not necessarily turn you into a championship team, but there are not many teams you could name that are just terrible at the bottom of the league who have an elite offensive line. So I'd focus there. I mean, I think after quarterback, that's the first place I'd look. And as you said, Joe Douglas is, to his credit, he's tried to address it, unlike his predecessors. His 2 most immediate predecessors did seem to not care about the offensive line. Joe Douglas tried. It just hasn't worked out. Some of that's bad luck. A lot of it's Joe Douglas has just missed. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please a big thumbs up. These things help the podcast out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Have a great Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.